One of the things that's very frustrating is that so many of the therapies depend on thinking. And the thinking and the language is not where the trauma is stored, and it's not where the addiction's stored. You can have somebody who knows all about addiction, who knows all about their addiction, and they can't apply it to themselves when they're triggered. And so what we want to do is we want to get both sides of the brain. We want to get that information communicating and integrating. And when you have that, behavior changes.
Laurel, welcome to the show. To get started, could you maybe give us a bit of your background and your trajectory and what got you interested in using EMDR as a way to treat addiction?
So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm also an EMDR therapist. If you want to know, EMDR stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. It's a therapy that's really for treating trauma, large and small trauma. And so my entire clinical background, I'm a clinical psychologist, has been in the treatment of trauma. I came up in the early years working with children and families, and later with adults. And because I always work with early childhood traumas, I always saw the connection between addictions and early traumas, or any kind of traumas. So, and I haven't come up in the addictions field. I came up in the trauma field. And so I've been, using, and what I found was with EMDR, and that's part of my story, is that I found with EMDR, often when we worked on the traumas, the desire to use the substance went away. They no longer had that drive. So where in the kind of the general information that time was, if you have somebody who's early in recovery, you don't do any deeper work with them. You just avoid that until they're really well established. Well, I found that you may never get them there, because the addiction, the traumas are driving the addiction. And when you can work on what's driving the addiction, you can get the addiction to resolve, or they can get ahead of it. So that's where I came to it, more from the trauma field. And then I'm also looking at, what does the substance use or abuse or the behavior serve? What's it serving? And so, again, that's more of a trauma lens, and looking at what is driving this, and then bringing a lot of different tools to bear on that.
That's so interesting. Something I'm curious to ask you is there anything that you believe about addiction that would go against the conventional wisdom, or that most people wouldn't agree with?
I don't really know fully what addiction is these days. I think what's happened is that label has been put on just about any behavior that seems compulsive and out of control. And so maybe what I'm more interested in is what's driving the behavior, rather than labeling somebody an addict. I'm a sex addict, I'm a chocolate addict, I'm a, whatever. It's more like, let's look at what this really is for the person and see if we can get at the roots of that and help resolve that. And then oftentimes you get a full resolution of whatever that is. So does that mean they had an addiction, or is it really that whatever this behavior was reinforced because it was giving them something that helped them with whatever the feelings or distress was that was under it? So that's where I kind of look at labeling people a little bit differently in terms of how many things are getting called addictions. So it's like, okay, what is that really? Like a love addiction? A love addiction? What does that really mean? It's like you're addicted to love. Well, maybe that's not a bad thing, but are they repeating sexually compulsive behaviors that aren't serving them, that feels out of control? Then what's driving that behavior? What's that about? So that's maybe more of what I'm looking at. Again, I'm not coming from the addictions field. I'm really coming from the trauma field, from my roots in early childhood traumas that tend to also get linked up to behaviors to help manage flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, depression, all of those things.
I think this is when the most exciting breakthroughs happen, though, when someone from one field comes to a completely different field with their perspective and then applies those ideas to those fields. So this is why it's really exciting to be having this conversation with you. And, something I think maybe I'm curious to ask as well is, what is the unique contribution that EMDR you think can help or can make to the addiction field?
So let me kind of back up a little bit, and I'm going to give you the definition of two different things. So standard EMDR, and the whole idea with EMDR is that you light up the memory network where the trauma is stored. You add alternating bilateral stimulation, which can be eye movements, it can be alternate tapping, auditory stimulation, and it sets off a rapid processing effect so that the person has thoughts, feelings, and body sensations, and they move to what we call an adaptive resolution. They move towards health and wholeness. So what was distressing and self-referential in the beginning becomes, it's in the past. They have a positive view of themselves in the situation that's really adaptive. So in order to do EMDR, you have to have enough emotional strength. You have to be able to handle the high affect. You have to be able to think and feel difficult things. You have to have enough ego strength. All of those things have to be on board. And you also have to have an activated memory network, something that you can locate that is traumatizing. Now, so with that, those are the things you need to have in order to do EMDR. And you need a very skilled clinician because this can be very intensive. Then there's what we call resource tapping, resource installation or resource tapping. It's an EMDR related technique that we've used for years to strengthen people prior to doing the trauma work. And what we do with this is we light up resources inside through the use of imagination that are strengthening, that you need in order to calm yourself down or connect with strength or to motivate or to help uplift for depression. So the resources, what we do with this is we activate these connections to resilience through the use of imagination, which lights up these neural pathways. And then we add short amount of bilateral stimulation. And the lighting up and linking it up seems to change the nervous system. So what we found is not just using the resources to prepare people for the trauma work, but using the resources for strengthening them in general and helping to manage symptoms that have been feeling unmanageable. Somebody who's feeling incredibly anxious, and so they grab, a beer and then more and more beer. If we can work on the anxiety and what's driving the anxiety and give them tools for decreasing the anxiety, maybe they won't need, the substance to be able to manage that. So we have these two things. We have EMDR to work on the traumas, and then we have this resource tapping or resource installation for all kinds of applications. So what the EMDR can do, working on the traumas, it can clear out the trauma memories that are driving the behaviors, the flashbacks, the nightmares, the feeling of completely overwhelmed, the being triggered by things. So the EMDR will resolve that. That can often decrease those drives for using. And then the resourcing, if somebody isn't ready to do the EMDR or they don't have a good EMDR therapist available, they can do these other techniques that are in my book. That's the other thing. This is the book. It's called Rewiring the Addicted Brain. You see it with EMDR-based treatment. And those techniques are in the book.
Fantastic. Okay. There's so much in there. And something that I found fascinating when I discovered it is like, I'm not sure if it's fully understood now, why this works, like what the mechanism is. But one of the sort of theories about why it might work is that we're connecting the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Could you maybe expand on that a bit more and what might be happening there?
In terms of EMDR?
In terms of EMDR and resource tapping?
Yeah. So with EMDR, it seems, and we don't have the brain science to really show us. We have theories about why this is working. It seems that when a trauma occurs, it gets frozen in the nervous system in fragmented form. So the thoughts, feelings, body sensations are all fragmented. And the fragmentation seems to be on the right side of the brain. The right side of the brain doesn't have the sense of chronological time. It doesn't have language, which is on the other side of the brain. So all of those ways in which we want to talk about something, it's not reaching where the trauma is stored.
Mm.
So EMDR, what EMDR does is it seems to set off this rapid processing effect, integrating the left and right hemispheres. Also, what Daniel Siegel says is it seems to integrate base brain, midbrain, and frontal lobes, as well as left and right hemispheres. So you get this full brain integration of information. They liken it to what's happening with REM or dream sleep. So when we're dreaming, our eyes are moving rapidly back and forth, and we're processing information. Now, what's been interesting with the EMDR is that many of us in the world who use this have stopped using eye movements, directed eye movements. So it was called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. But many of us have stopped using eye movements because clients don't like it and they can't connect to imagery well with eye movements, or they get their eyes hurt, or all kinds of reasons. But we found they can tap like this, they can have auditory stimulation, and it sets off that very same process of rapid information processing. In fact, for many people, what will happen is they're tapping, their eyes are closed, and their eyes are twitching under their eyelids very rapidly. So it seems to be doing something like this. It seems to, I think it seems to integrate information very rapidly. I think it processes information. And I also think it has a calming response for the system. So Bruce Perry, who's a researcher in working with children, he posited the theory that what's happening is the rhythm. And what you see is that people all over the world, indigenous people all over the world, use drumming and dancing as part of their ways to heal. We've seen this in Africa. We've seen this in North America. We've seen this in South America. We've seen this all over. When you begin to talk to people about what they've done historically for trauma resolution, it's circle dancing, drumming, that kind of thing. And so what he posited he thinks is happening is that when the baby is in utero, it's hearing the beat of the mother's heart. And so that rhythm becomes hardwired into the developing nervous system, linked to comfort. So what you do when a baby's upset, you rock the baby, use rhythm, right? You pat the baby, you rock the baby. So what he thinks is going on with EMDR, this was his theory, was that we light up the trauma network and the sympathetic nervous system, and then we add rhythm to it, which is the parasympathetic system, and they short circuit each other. So you can't have both an activating and a deactivating experience at the same time. So it just settles people down. What's interesting about this, I have to say, is it works on animals. It works on cats and dogs and horses. Those are the stories I've heard over the years, is they have an animal that's upset, they tap bilaterally on the animal and it soothes the animal. I know people who are working with horses, distressed horses, and they're using this bilateral tapping on the animal to calm the horse down. So there seems to be something hardwired in our nervous system that this bilateral soothes and comforts, as well as it can set off this rapid processing effect, and it can integrate information. So we need more brain scans to see what exactly is going on, but there's something that's going on.
This is fascinating. And can I just clarify, when you say the sympathetic system short circuits the parasympathetic system short circuits the sympathetic system, when you say short circuits, what do you mean there? Do you mean like it cancels it out?
You can't have both at the same time.
Okay.
So you're activated, and then you add something calming. It doesn't allow it.
Interesting. And whenever, we're going back to the hemispheres, whenever we're sort of maybe increasing communication between both of them, do you think this is one of the reasons why EMDR can really help with addiction? Because you're helping somebody take what might be known intellectually, but they find it very difficult to apply. And then it becomes emotional for them, it becomes part of the right brain, embodied emotional knowing.
I think that's exactly right. So one of the things that's very frustrating is that so many of the therapies depend on thinking. And the thinking and the language is not where the trauma is stored, and it's not where the addiction is stored. So you can have somebody who knows all about addiction, who knows all about their addiction, and they can't apply it to themselves when they're triggered, right? It's like they could teach the course in all of this. And so what we want to do is we want to get both sides of the brain. We want to get that information communicating and integrating. And when you have that, behavior changes. This is, to me, this is why I call it rewiring the addicted brain. This is this aha. It's like, no, you can't talk them through, because that's not where it's stored. But if you get this information linking up, then you're going to get a change in behavior. And all that shaming that's done to people, it's terrible. So what we want to do is we want to begin to rewire. And so this whole idea of Hebb's law, that neurons that fire together wire together, right? So when you repeat something over and over again, those neurons are going to link up. And so that circuitry is just going to repeat over and over again. So part of what we want to do is we want to disrupt that circuitry. And there's a number of different ways we can do that, right? So we can disrupt it by using resources, activating resources, and then linking them into that circuitry. We can disrupt the circuitry by working on the traumas that are linked to the behaviors, and then that will disrupt the circuitry. So when we start thinking in terms of how can we change the patterning in a way that makes sense for this individual, you can really change the behaviors. And it's wonderful. It's so exciting because this is all possible.
Amazing. And does this only work for things like trauma and addictions, or have you had any experience of this being used in, like, say, like a coaching capacity, for example, where you're helping somebody to do something similar?
Yeah. So let me define trauma too, because I think we have this idea that it has to be, like assault or a car accident or war. So we have what we call large T traumas and small T traumas. So large T traumas are the kinds of traumas that lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. War traumas, accidents, sexual assaults, all those things are typical big Ts. But we have so many small Ts. They can be the bullying in school. They could be the humiliations. They can be somebody who's LGBTQ who was put down repeatedly, who was not loved or accepted growing up. There's just somebody was told because they have difficulties learning that they're stupid, and so they feel small and incompetent. So these kind of small, so-called small things can profoundly impact one's self-esteem. And all that adolescent stuff, a lot of addictions, these behaviors start in adolescence, where these things go in, and they end up going in a big way. They seem like small. From the outside, they look small, but from the inside, they feel big. And then they reverberate out. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. I'll never, have a girlfriend, boyfriend, partner. All of those things can go in. So this is where we look for these small things even, and we have ways of doing that. And we can begin to untangle and resolve some of these old patterns that are, shame-based, often shame-based, that are then linked to the behaviors. As far as coaching, absolutely. So this is where this is more the resourcing rather than the trauma focus. It's the resourcing focus. It could be imagine what your life would be like if you didn't have this behavior in your life, if you were living free of it. Imagine that, kind of embody that, add bilateral stimulation, right? What do you need in order to feel strong and competent? Bring up memories of when you had that in some place in your life. So you're lighting up memories of strong and competent, feel it in your body, add bilateral stimulation. Or they can't remember anything from their life, but they've got it. They have somebody they know, or somebody from history or in a movie or a book, a role model who's got that. They can bring that person to mind and feel that sense of it and add bilateral stimulation. So there's tons of stuff you can do. This is around that motivation. Where do you want to go? I think it's so important to focus on where you want to go, not where you've been, right? All those shame stuff, you're stupid, you're bad, why do you keep doing this? And not identifying with the addiction rather than as a whole human being. And then where do you want to go? Let's focus on what your life can look like. Imagine what your life can look like if you were free of this behavior. So yeah, there's tons of stuff around that motivation.
Amazing, amazing. So when I bought the book, Laurel, I was a bit surprised, to be honest. I was expecting a very narrowly focused book on EMDR for addiction, and I was shocked by the breadth and the just how holistic a lens you have taken on this subject. I want to ask, why is it important that we view addiction in a broader context and take this view on it?
Well, I think for one thing, so much addiction treatment doesn't work, right? So why isn't it working? Why, and for me, it's just so important to take a holistic lens and look at each individual and see for each person what's driving the behavior. What is this? When did it begin? What purpose is it serving for them? And then designing your treatment plan around the individual rather than, one size fits all. So many of the treatment programs, I've had family members who've been through them and they're so shame-based. They were shame-based. They were horrible. They were completely ineffective. And my son, who was going through this, he just rejected all of it. He said, this is all nonsense. And so when I wrote the book, I wrote it for him. It's like if I could design something that I think would work for him, it has to feel positive. It has to feel affirming. It's not a denial of the problem, but it's looking at how can we engage in something that's going to support you in finding a life free of this? What's the direction? And then again, each person is different. I think for a lot of people, connecting with nature is so powerful and so helpful, and finding things that do work for them and then focusing on those things. Again, it's like tailoring it to the individual, focusing on that.
To what extent do you think we have an innate and natural healing system within us?
I completely believe that. I mean, this is where I've seen it thousands of times. It's kind of the founding philosophy of EMDR. Francine Shapiro based EMDR on that. She calls it the adaptive information processing model. And it's very holistic. It's very humanist. It's like from humanistic psychology. And now many different therapies are describing this, but it's really what we see. And for example, when we're doing EMDR and we focus on the trauma and we process it with bilateral stimulation, the person naturally moves towards health and wholeness. If they have a functioning brain, I have to say, if they have a functioning brain, if they do engage in this processing effect, it always goes towards health and wholeness. And I describe it this way because it's from my Buddhist background, and it's a Buddhist metaphor. It's our true self is like the sun that's always shining. And the manifestation of our true self is love and compassion and wisdom and kind of a grounded empowerment. But what happens as we go through life, as we have these experiences that create contractions in the mind and the body, we develop a self-construct based on these things that have happened to us. I'm not good enough. I'm not safe. I can never accomplish anything. All these kind of negative core beliefs that get reinforced over time. And what they do is they block the sun. They block the expression of our true self. They're false, and that they're just clouds. And what we find is when we do EMDR, we focus on where the clouds are. We look at where the sadness is. We look at where the hate is. We look at where the anger is. We look at where the negative self-constructs are. And as we're doing that, they dissipate and disappear. Mm. And then what manifests is love and compassion and often creative expression. Somebody who is a natural artist will start painting. If they're a dancer, they'll dance. If they're a singer, they'll sing. If they have psychic abilities, those will start being expressed. So whatever our natural inclinations are, there's no longer blocks to those. And so I've just seen tremendous creative expression come from this. But always, always there is compassion for self and others. This kind of broader self-acceptance is a natural result. We're not guiding them that way. They naturally go there. And I know that a lot of other therapies are discovering the same thing, but I just trust that. I don't trust what I would tell somebody to do. I can trust what will unfold and where they will land at the end of the work.
Amazing. Now, you know, something has a lot of truth to it if there are parallels in other therapies. And in IFS, for example, with Dick Schwartz, like he talks about that too. You know, these protector parts are sort of almost like clouds and they're in the way. But if you can let those parts know they're safe and help them sort of relax, then sort of like the clouds part and the self or the sun shines through and can really sort of be an internal leader for the person, you know. So I think there's definitely something to this idea. So a big part of the book, Laurel, is attachment-focused EMDR. Now, what is this for anybody that's hearing about it for the first time?
Yeah, so attachment-focused EMDR evolved out of standard EMDR, and it's something that I developed. Another book is called Attachment-Focused EMDR, Healing Relational Trauma, also published by W.W. Norton. And what I found is that standard EMDR over the years has become very rigid, very scripted, and it doesn't work so well for many people, especially, how do I put it? It's just become very rigid and scripted. And so I've been working with a range of different people from all over the world most of my career, and a lot of time in my EMDR career. I teach in Asia, I teach in Curacao, in all over Europe. And what I've seen is people need you to adapt what you do according to them, instead of imposing the same thing on everybody. And so what I found early on is that we needed to add in more resourcing. We needed to provide more support for people. I needed to modify the standard protocol and make it go more smoothly, make it more client-centered. And so with attachment-focused EMDR, we focus on safety. It's client-centered. We emphasize the importance of the therapeutic relationship. We use this resource tapping, as I'm describing, for strengthening people, but we also use it to repair developmental deficits. And then we use a modified version of EMDR that's smoother, more, easier to apply, and less kind of jerking people around. The client feels attuned to in a smoother, more caring, compassionate way. Now, what we're also doing, and this is one of the things with EMDR, is standard EMDR is focused on the traumas, right? So when you have a traumatic experience, there's emotions connected to it and negative self-constructs. But there are so many people who have traumas, but they also have what didn't happen. They didn't have love. They didn't have consistent parenting. Maybe they had drug-addicted parents. They had foster homes. They have all this disruption. So what's most significant is the lack of not having had. So they have what I call developmental deficits. They have holes. And so what happens when you have somebody who has these developmental deficits, they have trouble with emotional regulation. They have trouble self-soothing. They may turn to substances more easily because they can't soothe themselves because they don't have that internal structure. And so blaming them, why can't you do this? Well, they never had a loving mother to calm them down when they had distress. They were left on their own. And so many of these children growing up who came from very chaotic backgrounds found that as soon as they found alcohol, or they found cutting, or they found snorting something, that it helped them escape from the life that they were in. And they just didn't have the means for that emotional regulation. So with attachment-focused EMDR, with all of the safety that we develop, we can focus on creating an ideal mother, ideal father, ideal family, whatever situation works for them, and then redoing development through imagination and bilateral stimulation. It's profound. It's incredible. This is where we can rewire attachment. And the results we're getting are just amazing. Some people who never had any security growing up, if they can imagine it, they can contact those felt experiences through imagination. They can do this repair. It's working great with our LGBTQ community too, where there's been so much rejection, hurt, damage, that they can create the family constellation that works for them. Maybe two dads and a mom, maybe two moms and a dad, maybe no dad, whatever, maybe a community, whatever is going to work for them to feel loved, cared for, connected to, a place where they belong. All of this can be done with imagination and bilateral stimulation. So that's kind of my shortcut on attachment-focused EMDR. So it's only through our organization, the Parnell Institute, that we teach and we train clinicians in attachment-focused EMDR specifically. We found that we absolutely had to evolve from standard EMDR, because standard EMDR was injuring people because it was focusing them to fit within a standard protocol that just doesn't fit for so many people.
This is incredible, and it's making a lot of sense. And just going back to the trauma piece, for a species as our own that's so hardwired for attachment and connection, then the omission of those things can be as damaging for us as the commission of a traumatic act. And your approach of healing developmental deficits through creating an ideal mother or an ideal father, whatever, it just seems like it makes so much sense to me, Yeah. But how, if a clinician is listening to this, and they're like, oh, that sounds really cool, like how might they, obviously they would take a training with you, but just to give them an idea of how this process might work, how they might help a client to create an ideal mother, what does that actually look like in practice?
So how it would look like in practice is somebody comes in to see you and you hear what, the symptoms or problems they've come in with. And you then get a good developmental history and you're hearing what's going on there. If you're hearing from the get-go, they weren't wanted, they were placed in foster care, the parents were addicted, and then they turned to addiction as an adolescent to try to manage all this emotional distress that they couldn't, manage. So I'm hearing this kind of a history, and then they have a mess in their adulthood because of the results of trying to manage their emotions through substances or behaviors. So what we could do is we'll say, would you like to imagine creating a mother, the mother that you wished you had? She can be any way you would like her to be. And then and it's recognizing that you didn't have this and you need this. We can't change what happened to you, but we can change how it feels inside. And so maybe they say, you know what? My neighbor, she was who I wanted as my mom. And I spent a lot of time at her house and she was really kind. I loved how she was with her kids. And they just right away say, yeah, I want Mrs. So-and-so to be my ideal mother. So they can imagine this person. And then we'll, really contact the feeling of being in her presence and being with her, and we'll add bilateral stimulation. Maybe they say, I can't think of anyone, but we'll create a list of characteristics that they would want. And then we'll add bilateral stimulation to these characteristics. And then maybe a sense of a mother like this would form. So then there's it's all in the book. So the book is Attachment-Focused EMDR, Healing Relational Trauma. And I have videos and, ways of showing what this looks like. So then let's say the person says, okay, I've got a good sense of what this mother would be like. You could say, imagine you're conceived in love. Your mother and your father really want you, and you're in her womb and she's really happy and she wants you. And then we're adding bilateral stimulation. So if we're doing virtually, they can tap themselves like this, or the sides of their legs, or they can have auditory stimulation. If we're in office, they might have little devices that they hold that buzz back and forth, or headphones, or again, they could tap themselves. And so, well, okay, can you imagine being in the womb? And they'll say, yes, I can imagine that. Okay. And they'll go for a while and I'll check in. I'll say, how was that? Oh, that felt so good. I felt relaxed. Okay. Are you ready to be born? Okay. Yes. How would you like to imagine your birth? Oh, I want my mother to be supported. I want low light. I want my father to be there. I want my mother to have a lot of support in the room with her. I want her pain to be managed. Like all the things they want. Okay, so imagine that. And then add bilateral stimulation. And then sometimes they'll narrate out loud, and sometimes it's all to themselves. And then they'll open their eyes and they'll report their experience. Sometimes they're just narrating everything as the bilateral stimulation is going. And I'll check in. I'll say, how was that? Where are you now? Yeah, now I'm on my mother's chest. I feel the skin to skin. I see the love in her eyes. I'll say, do you want to take that in some more? Yes, we'll go further. So I kind of follow the client. Some of them will say, I really want to hang out with this, taking this in longer. or they'll quickly start moving through their entire development. So I'm just following them. Okay, does she take you home? Are you home with your mom now? Yeah. Okay. What's your room like? What's that like? You know what? I'm sleeping in my parents' bed between the two of them, and they love me and they want me, and I feel so safe. Okay, go with that. Tap, 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 tap. So some people have had a lot of injury because they were left in the crib for hours and hours and hours and not picked up. So when they do their own healing, they're going to imagine being held, not left. So then we'll just go slowly, slowly up. And sometimes it takes weeks and weeks and weeks. Sometimes they go through everything in one session, and they go, now they're in their 20s and they're having their own kids. And so the therapist follows the client, and you can seed it with what they need. Like if there was a lot of trauma and bullying in school, they can imagine what they need to get through that in a way that's healthy for them. You know, I've got a friend, or a big brother or someone, and I feel secure and I feel safe, and I'm not all alone at lunch, for example.
Amazing. And, you know, I've done quite a few interviews with people from loads of different backgrounds, and speaking to like Janina Fisher, for example, she would say that the number one variable in mental health and well-being is secure attachment. When it's there, it makes everything else easier. When it's missing, it makes everything else more difficult. And what you've essentially created here is a technology that fosters internal secure attachment via the imagination and these innate creative resources, which is just, you know, such a gift, you know, if you can get this out there and get people using it, you know, so it's fantastic. What I wanted to ask, you know, there's something in the book called resource installation. Could you maybe tell us what that is and how that works in practice?
So what I'm describing as resource tapping is resource installation. So kind of the history of EMDR, originally when Francine Shapiro was the developer of this, it was just about, you know, light up the network and go. No support, just drop them in the deep end and let them swim, right? Then she realized, we need to create a little bit of safety here. And so she created what she called the safe place, installing resource. It's installing the safe place. So it's imagining a place that's safe and using short amounts of bilateral stimulation to install it. Well, for one thing, I've never liked the word install. It sounds like you're taking something outside and putting it in, which isn't what we're doing. What we're doing is we're lighting up the neural networks, and then we're adding bilateral stimulation to link them up. So it's really light it up and link it up. And many of us, especially working with early childhood trauma, knew we needed more than safe place. In fact, we couldn't use the word safe because it was a triggering word. So many people with early childhood trauma, they can't find the word safe immediately brings up unsafe, the opposite. So they can't even use safe. So people all over the world are told, EMDR trained people all over the world are told, if you can't get a safe place, you can't do EMDR with somebody. And I'm like, of course not. Just don't use the word safe. Use the word peaceful. Use the word calm. Use the word happy. Anything, but you don't use the word safe, because immediately they think of unsafe, and then they can't get it, and it's triggering all their memories of being unsafe. So what a small group of us, early. So I was trained in 1991 in EMDR by Francine Shapiro. The first training was in 1990. So I was one of the early group. In fact, our early group helped develop EMDR because it was our work that then we fed back to Francine, who helped, you know, build it out. And what we saw very early on is that we needed more than one resource. And this is where in my standard attachment-focused EMDR training, we call 4 foundational resources: peaceful place, nurturing figures, protector figures, and wise figures. Then we have a team of resources. And what this does is it creates a sense of internal support. And then if we get into a stuck place, we've got resources to pull in to help the person get out of a stuck place. So with one of my books that I wrote for the general public, it's called Tapping In. It's published by Sounds True. All of us in EMDR have been teaching we've been using the resource tapping, resource installation with our clients for years, but it was like a secret. Only we knew how to do it. And I was at a place called Esalen Institute. It's on the Big Sur coast. You may know of it. I was teaching there, and Peter Levine was there also at the same time teaching. And, we were having a conversation, and he was talking about the books he had recently written. And I started thinking, what could I write that would be for the general public? And as I was driving up the Big Sur coast, the book came to my mind. The whole outline for the Tapping In book came. And I realized this is something so very simple that anybody can learn. So it doesn't have to be just for EMDR trained clinicians. In fact, the book has just been translated into Japanese, and I'm training Japanese in how to do this because it works super well for Asian population that are very uncomfortable with strong affect and that are so shame-based. So you work on the strengthening, So anyway, for the Tapping In book, the term install was just an awful word. It's like installing software or a battery or something. And it's not even what we do. So we came up with tapping in. As a lot of clients will say, well, let's tap that in. Let's tap that in. So the trouble is it's not the same as the EFT tapping. It's not tapping on acupressure points. It's bilateral tapping is really what it is. It's bilateral tapping. So it's alternating bilateral stimulation, not at the same time, but right, left, or left, right. So that's where it came from. So when you hear resource installation, it's the same thing as resource tapping.
Okay. It makes a lot of sense. Can you tell me about the bridging technique?
You're really wanting the technical stuff. Okay, so the bridging technique, this is really, it's a technique I developed out of something in hypnotherapy called the affect bridge. And so with EMDR, what we're always looking for is what in the past is linked to the problem in the present. Okay, so we want to get at the root of the problem. And when we find the root and we reprocess it, it generalizes up through the network. So think of wanting to get the root of the problem, and then you pull it up, you take care of it in a big way. But if you start at the top, often you don't get it out. You just activate everything, all the different associations and memories of something. So we want to get the root of the problem. Very often people don't know what it is. They don't know why they're having this, why they're triggered, or why they're having this particular problem. They can't tell you what it is. So when that happens, I use what I call the bridging technique. Many people in EMDR have been trained in what they call float back. I developed the bridging technique around the same time float back came around. They all have the same origins, which is in the affect bridge that Watkins developed. So affect bridge is where this comes from. I'd had a basic hypnotherapy training, and this is where I got it. But you don't have to be hypnotized to do this. So what we do, let's say it's a trigger for overeating. Like the person is like binging and they have this problem. So I'll say, okay, give me an example of when you did this recently. What's a typical pattern? Yeah, it's when I come home from work and I'm really tired and I'm really hungry, and then I just go right into the kitchen and I just eat everything and I feel horrible afterwards. So I'll say, okay, great. Close your eyes and go inside and bring yourself to the moment right before you start eating. So I want to find what's happening right before. I walk in the door and I hear my husband and son upstairs. And in that moment, I feel sad and lonely. What's in your body? I feel really empty. There's like this empty feeling in my stomach. What's the thought or belief that goes with that? I'm completely alone and unloved. Just immediate. So I'm lighting up this neural network that's associated with that moment of the trigger. And then I say, trace it back in time. Go back as far as you can without censoring it. And no bilateral stimulation. And I just say, trace it back. I don't say, look for a time. I don't say, look for a memory. I don't ever use the word look, because if you do that, they're coming up. Really what we're doing is we're activating the right hemisphere, and then we're going back with the unconscious mind. And then it's like they're going down floors, and then they land somewhere, and then they describe what it is. And it may or may not be a memory. It could be a metaphor. It could be a visual representation of something. And then that is what we work with. So one woman, what came up was an image of a naked baby completely alone, just kind of like floating in space. And this baby was completely alone, disconnected. And then we light that up, that picture, and then we process that. And then when that feels done, 0 to 10, it's a 0. What do you believe? I'm loved. I'm connected. We put that in. Then I'll go back up to walking through the door, going back to the triggering. And what do you notice now? Oh, now I'm coming in the door and I'm going upstairs and I'm hugging my husband, hugging my son. And then I'm going into the kitchen and making myself something healthy to eat. And I'll say, okay, go with that. So the bridge is tracing back from a trigger, from a behavior, from something in the present that is activating something, but they don't know what it is. And then we trace it back in time. Is that making sense?
It is. There's so much there. And I'm sorry it is, but I have to ask another technical question.
Okay.
The connecting to consequences protocol, could you maybe give us an outline of that too?
That is one of the greatest breakthroughs of probably anything I've done in all of my work. It's absolutely extraordinary. And the results we're getting with this are like incredible. So here's what it is. I had a client who was a very high functioning person in a lot of ways, but he was going down the slippery slope to cocaine addiction. He was using cocaine more and more and more. He had it under control for a while, and then he just found himself getting it more often. And he would describe his process. He would have it, he would wait, he would schedule when he'd use it, and he would take time off of work. This was a person who was exquisitely connected to his body. This wasn't somebody who was like, sitting in a chair watching TV all day. This was a person who was a top athlete. So he was going down the slippery slope, and he was describing the use of it, the anticipation, the excitement about it, the taking time off from work, then staying up all night, the high, and then the horrible experience of coming off. The physical depletion, the self-hate, the shame, it was awful. So he was describing this to me, and my brain went, how could you do this to yourself? Like a very critical kind of, how could you do this, right? And then the next thought, of course, I didn't say that to him. The next thought was, how could you do, how is this possible? Somebody who's so connected to himself could do something so awful to himself. And then the next thought I had was, because it's not linked up in the brain. Not linked up in the brain. And then I thought, I bet if we link this up in his brain, he'll stop the behavior. So what we did, and this is where I really believe that bilateral stimulation integrates memory networks, I developed the connecting I tried it with him and it worked amazing. So I said, okay, I want you to play the movie in your mind of your last experience with cocaine, of feeling like you want to get it, getting it, having it, the high, and then the coming down. Because what happens is the high and the consequence don't get linked up in the brain. Remember the whole thing about neurons that fire together, wire together? So the excitement and the high all gets linked up in a loop, and the consequence doesn't get linked up. It's stored somewhere else. So so I said, play the movie continuously of the getting it, the high, and then what happens afterwards, all the way through to how horrible you felt. We ran it through. And you can do a 0 to 10, what's your urge for use right now? Like you really want to get it, or 10, like 10 you really want it, or 0 you don't care at all. So we ran this through from beginning to end. And then it was like, when you think of cocaine now, do you want it? No. Ran it through one more time. That was all he did. Never used cocaine again, ever. 10 years, no cocaine. We've done this. So I've done this with meth, with alcohol, with diabulimia, with so many different behaviors. And we're getting extremely good results with more in cocaine. So the trick with this is you have to have a consequence. You also have to have a functioning brain, right? So, and there's lots of cases in the book and the Rewiring the Addicted Brain of what this looks like. So run the movie. So run the movie all the way through. Sometimes there's a few waves. They'll go for a while. They'll stop. You pick up the sequence and you keep it going with bilateral stimulation. You've got to link up that consequence. And then you run it through a few times. And now when you think of using cocaine, where are you? Do you want it? 0? 0 don't want it at all, 10 the most. And if it's still anywhere there, just run it through again. And then the other things, there's a couple other things you can do. You can do what I call installing the negative consequence. Think of cocaine. Now remember the consequence. Put those things together in your mind, add bilateral stimulation. So you're directly linking the consequence with the substance or the behavior, right? Then you can do, this is kind of the variations on A Christmas Carol. Imagine what your life would be like if you keep using cocaine in this way. Like you're looking at where this is going to go. This is not a good, happy ending. And then you use bilateral stimulation as they imagine going down that road. Now imagine what your life could be like if you stopped using cocaine and you got healthy and you did whatever, X, Y, and Z in a healthy way. Imagine a positive future, bilateral stimulation. So there you go. That's kind of, that's it in a nutshell. It's just been amazing. I've gotten so much feedback over the years, ever since I put this together, of what it works for. So what it doesn't do is it doesn't get at the roots, whatever in the past is driving the behaviors to begin with. But what we're finding in the feedback, and I thought when we were doing substance abuse treatment that we would do this maybe later in treatment. We start with resourcing people, maybe do the trauma work, then maybe do this. But what we're finding is some people in substance abuse treatment do this right away. And then what happens is they don't have to do all that work to have them, stop using whatever the substance is. They just don't want it anymore. So now all the energy put into, avoiding or not using, you don't have to put the energy into that. Now what you can do is you can work on what was driving the behaviors and creating, healthy living, healthy food, resourcing them, and working on the traumas. And then you can get ahead of the relapse, but you haven't spent so much time getting them to stop. They just don't want to use it. One of the inspirations was anabuse. You give people anabuse, and if they drink, they're going to throw up. So of course, they're not going to want to drink. With the consequence, that is a real consequence, when you link that up, why would you do something that now you feel the consequence? It's not in a separate network. So that's that whole thing we were talking about in the very beginning about stuff just not linked up in the brain. When you link it up in the brain, the behaviors change. But it's not the shaming them. I had all those shaming thoughts. Why? How could you do this to yourself? It's like, how could you? It just doesn't make any sense. It's not linked up in the brain. It's in a reinforcement pattern, right? Feel bad, do this, feel better, and then feel like crap. So when you connect that, like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. That's, it's just amazing. If people could just learn this, there would be so much less time spent in treatment and self-anger and, shame and all the rest of it. It just stops it. But then you have to do the hard work that's about what's driving this.
I'm really starting to see why you've called this book Rewiring the Addicted Brain, and there's so much power in what you're sharing here, Laurel. Like there's so much to it. I'm shocked, to be honest, because just like so many light bulbs are going off in my head. Yeah. And I personally, it's nowhere near like a cocaine thing or anything, but I personally struggled with caffeine, like trying to give up caffeine for years, and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't give it up. And then I'd listened to this audiobook it's like Alan Carr's Easy Way to Quit Caffeine or whatever. And what is it essentially doing? It's just like, he's just connecting the consequences of the caffeine consumption. And it's just like, some kind of rewiring things going on there or whatever, just in the background. And after listening to that book, like my desire for coffee and all, it just went away. It wasn't like I was willpower or nothing. And I think it's similar. Obviously, yeah. the element that's missing there is a bilateral stimulation, but it was enough for me just to hear that and then go, every time I think of coffee, now the link isn't like all of these pleasurable things. It's all of the consequences. At least for me, it works for some people. I'm not saying coffee is bad. It doesn't work for
No,
my
it's,
nervous system,
this is, you hit it exactly. If it's just thinking, it's not going to work. And I think, I mean, in AA, I think they say what is it? It's like think through the drink or something, but that's thinking. It's like you need to connect the consequences all the way through with the somatic component and bilateral stimulation. And they're already onto something, but if it's just thinking, it's not going to do it. And then there's so much shame involved with these things. There's so much shame, and this kind of takes the shame out of it, and it looks at, what really is going on here, and how do we best address this, and look at it on a, from a brain view.
What role can a higher power play in recovery, do you think?
I think the spiritual component is important. It depends upon the person. For some people, if they can connect to that, that can lead to more self-love. It can lead to motivation. I really believe that somewhat what happens with addiction is you begin to feel so bad about yourself that it then it drives it even further. It's like, why not? I'm already a terrible person. And what we want to connect their essential goodness, connect to something larger than themselves, but in a way that doesn't feel like a Band-Aid, that doesn't feel like a prescription. And many people connect to something larger than themselves in nature. In the trees and the flowers, in the sense of life renewing itself. So, what makes sense to them? It's easiest with people who've had those experiences, real experiences, authentic experiences of that, rather than just saying, you've got to find that. Otherwise you can't do the program. It's like, okay, let's see what you have, how you've had experience something like that.
Definitely. Okay. So just a couple more questions to wrap up here. First one is, if you could get a letter to everybody in the world currently struggling with an addiction, and you had to include a few kind of key points on this letter, what might you say?
Love yourself. Love yourself. Find a way to connect to your essential self, your essential goodness. Take a step out and see, what in the past is linked to whatever this is, and what's the best way to address that in a way that's compassionate. I think like that, whether it's bringing resources to it, compassion, support, or finding a good trauma therapist to work on the traumas that are driving the behaviors. But really look at it in more of an objective way, a compassionate, objective way. It's like, oh, what is this? Rather than you're an addict, that kind of beating somebody over the head with that. It's like, okay, well, what's really going on here? It's like bringing that. So many people are using because of anxiety and trauma. It's just loneliness, so many different things. There was something else I was thinking of. Anyway, what else you want to ask me?
We're also creating a resource for people that are participating in the summit. It's basically a reading list where we're asking each speaker for 3 book recommendations to help mental health professionals better understand addiction. So if you could just recommend 3 books that you think would be really helpful for somebody in this field, and I would 100% recommend Rewiring the Addicted Brain as a first, of course. But are there any others that come to mind?
Well, the Attachment-Focused EMDR Healing Relational Trauma, that's another book. And then the Tapping In, that's so Attachment-Focused EMDR Healing Relational Trauma is about the developmental repair in EMDR that I refer to in the Rewiring the Addicted Brain. And then the Tapping In, which is published by Sounds True, there's also an audio component to it. It has the basic exercises connected to it and how to do it, that it will be so easy for people to be able to apply. As I said, that one's just been translated into Japanese, and my goodness, it's already changing their views on things. It's helping to really connect to these resources that everywhere you go, you can take them with you. They're not dependent on anything outside yourself.
Fantastic. Okay. Awesome. And for anybody that's listening to this and they would love to take a training with you and or maybe in attachment-focused EMDR, where can they learn more and see what's on offer?
Yeah, it's parnellemdr.com. parnellemdr.com. That's our website. It has our trainings, it has course materials, it has workshops. Lots of stuff is there, including demo videos where it shows what the work looks like.
I've been shocked, like so pleasantly surprised by what I've discovered just from a little bit of research and even this 1 hour conversation with you. I was expecting, a very narrowly focused approach to addiction treatment, and what I've discovered is something so incredibly deep and rich and holistic. So I just feel really lucky to have had this opportunity to speak with you today, and I just want to wish you the best going forward and just keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate speaking with you.